Good day to you. And what are your plans for the next few hours? If you're getting this in the morning, are you one of those people who have had a Monday class canceled for 3-4 times up until yesterday, and now all of a sudden you have a bunch of work dumped on you, and now you have to figure out a way to catch up 3 weeks of work for that class while you're also trying to continue your other classes? And do you feel like, well, that class kind of seemed a little bit jinxed from the beginning, so I'm just going to do what's necessary to catch up, and probably everybody else in the class is going to be in the same boat. So we're just going to do enough to say, okay, I've done the assignments, but it's not going to be like you put your heart and soul in it. I don't know if that's accurately describing the kind of approach that you have. But if it is, you may not realize it, but you're actually following a philosophy of how to complete that particular class, and perhaps even a larger philosophy about how to approach your schoolwork in general. Because philosophies underlie our decision-making. They guide the way that we set things up in life, in this case, a class. And today, a particular shout out to Nick, who's in the class. He's the only philosophy major in the class, and let's see if some of these themes that we talk about resonate with him because of his coursework that he's had before. Yeah, kind of philosophy at play there, hoping that your coursework in one major also has tie-in with coursework in another major. At any rate, I have a little tree behind me here. It's just an accident, I promise. And that's kind of the way that we see trees. We don't really see the underneath of the tree. We see, the tree from the ground up. And it's pretty impressive, a tree, but not nearly as impressive if you think about the fact that most trees you only are seeing half of. Yeah, there's a whole other half of that tree that is under the ground in terms of its root system. And so with that thought, think about philosophies as root systems for a tree. They are pulling the nutrients out of the soil, which we've already identified as cultural characteristics, and they're pulling those nutrients up into the tree and giving it its basic base of stability. So this is the second element that we're studying in the media system as a tree metaphor taken on the roots today. And we're going to start with the very first philosophy. It's one that in retrospect, that is from the vantage point of today, seems to be really outdated and too harsh and severe. But I don't want you to think of it that way. I want you to think of philosophies as growing up in a certain time period and being appropriate for that time period. And this philosophy is a time period philosophy. It's authoritarianism. Authoritarianism grew up, generally speaking, in 16th century Greece. It was written about by the philosopher Plato, and then later picked up by the Italian, I guess you could call him a philosopher. He was more like a philosopher king. He was head of state and went on to propel World War I. I'm talking about Machiavelli. Machiavelli was an Italian philosopher, and he spoke about a way of treating people that is laying down the iron fist. Because the authoritarian ruler is more all-knowing than the average people. And since the authoritarian ruler is all-knowing, that authoritarian ruler has an obligation to pass on his or her, usually his knowledge to the rest of the populace. In some cases, the authoritarian ruler has even asserted that they have a direct connection to a god. And therefore, since they have the only real knowledge from a higher deity, that the people down below have to rely on that authoritarian figure to know what the word of a god is, if you believe in a god. So yes, authoritarian figures can sometimes be priests or even popes, if you want to think of it, or heads of states. And so we have this kind of philosophy growing up in the 1600s. Why? Because during that time, it was kind of precarious whether you would live or not. We're talking about the plague. We're talking about diseases unknown. We're talking about warfare. We're talking about very rough living conditions, like all this cold weather that we're going through right now in Pennsylvania, 3 degrees, 4 degrees in February. We turn our heat on. But in the 1600s, you've got a fireplace and you're standing around it and you hope you can keep it going all night to stay warm. So conditions in authoritarian-induced countries in the 1600s were very, very harsh. So how does this translate to media systems? When you have a media system that grows up in a country that sees itself as authoritarian, the media system serves the state. That's its primary purpose, to serve the state. Because anything less, anything that criticizes the state or undermines the state or makes fun of the state, like a Daily Show and Jon Stewart in the news right now because Jon Stewart retiring, which regularly criticizes politicians, that doesn't happen in an authoritarian state because the state could fall. The state could fall for reasons that I mentioned earlier, disease, pestilence, population starving, but also because countries around the state may be hostile towards that state, may be wanting to move in to take its oil reserves, for example. So authoritarian states, they have an authoritarian rule where they assume that the media have to serve the state because you don't want to undermine the state, you don't want to make it weak. The whole thing may fall apart, and then you've got a real problem. The way that authoritarianism is implemented is through censorship. A lot of times, media content has to be looked at before it is published or before it is broadcast by heads of state or their designates to make sure that there's nothing in it that is an encrypted message asking for the government to be weakened or overthrown, or nothing in it that criticizes any dimension of how the supreme leader of the state is trying to run that state. Also, you have imprisonment and fines, and in some cases, you have the death penalty being exacted in authoritarian states. Think of it this way as we leave this philosophy behind. Your parents had a certain authoritarianism, I'm sure, when they were raising you. They decided you were going to have a curfew, for example, or they decided they were going to take away your cell phone when you didn't do something you were supposed to do, or they decided that you were not going to be permitted to hang out with certain friends. That's them looking out for you under the assumption that they know more than you, that you're young and you haven't yet matured, at least in those areas, and they have a right to say across the board, you are not doing this or there will be a punishment. That's authoritarianism in a nutshell. And by the way, just so that you don't have the misperception that the U.S. doesn't have any authoritarianism, after 9/11, which is a long time ago now, but still is very much a part of our culture, Congress passed a law that said that it's called the Patriot Act, that the government has a right to monitor your phone calls when you call somebody overseas. And that is authoritarianism. That's saying that we are going to invade your privacy to make sure that you're not speaking to somebody who could be a terrorist because we have that right because the country is vulnerable. All right, now let's move on to the second philosophy for today. That is libertarianism. Libertarianism, the philosophy that probably the United States associates with the most. It was a reaction to authoritarianism. It grew up in 17th century England. The main writers were John Locke and Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. These guys were also economists, and they were really interested in what a free market was all about and how that could fit into a country's political philosophy. Basically, libertarianism was rising up as a reaction to authoritarianism, and it said that, we want to have more concern about the individual, not about the state. We want the individual to be able to live without any intrusion from the state. But now this is going to require some things. It's going to require the individual to discover their own truth. It's going to require the individual to have some civic responsibility. That means to participate in the democratic process by voting, by arguing, by talking about issues, by being aware of issues. It's going to require some things on the part of the individual. It also means that the individual will have to take responsibility for their own actions. You break the law, you're going to be punished. You're going to be punished by a trial, or you're going to be punished by some other means, a fine or public shame. So you have to take responsibility for what you do. You tend to see libertarianism taking root in societies where there's a big suspicion of government. And sure, we have that in the United States, right? We really suspect that federal government is up to a lot of no good a lot of times. Just look at the Obamacare bill and how that is continues to be contested, even though it's a law of land, because of the fear of government getting in the lives of people's health care. And so we have that as part of our society, which makes us ripe for perceiving ourselves as being well-suited to a libertarian government. Hands off, government, hands off, let the individual decide. So in a libertarian government, basically you have the media are privately owned. Government does not own them. And actually in an authoritarian government, you also have media privately owned. It's just that the government doesn't want to run the media, but expects the media to do exactly what the government says. But in a libertarian media system, you have media that are privately owned, but they're allowed to make money. And so you have profit making, and you have also self-determination when it comes to media in libertarian societies. And that very much describes the United States because the vast majority of media are profit-making media. They're not service media first and foremost. They're not owned by public trusts. They're not owned by quasi-government agencies. They are, for the most part, running commercials and making money. And we'll revisit that later when we talk about financing. The way that media are, I won't say controlled in the system, but induced is you get rewards. You get rewards for making a lot of money. Like NBC is really scared right now for its evening news because it had the #1 evening news program with Brian Williams. But now that he's been caught lying about a grenade exploding in a helicopter he was in Iraq, he stepped away from that slot. And there's a lot of questions about can he ever get his reputation back as a news anchor. And in the meantime, the ratings are probably going to fall for NBC Evening News. And that's a big problem because that's a big moneymaker, a big profit-making machine. So you can see already that in the libertarian system, it's much more inclined to how well something is going to perform economically and how much of a profit it's going to make. You do have fines in this system as well. In the United States, we do have a bit of authoritarianism mixed with libertarianism when it comes to obscenity. If you say fuck repeatedly on the radio or in television, you're going to get fined by the FCC. That's just not tolerated. It's an authoritarian measure within a libertarian system using a libertarian financial penalty to try and bring in compliance. Let's move on now to the third philosophy. The third philosophy is communism. Communism is sort of out and out dismissed, but it has some interesting dimensions to it. It grew up in the 17th and 18th centuries in Germany, mostly through Hegel, the German philosopher, and Karl Marx. And unfortunately, it became operationalized in the Soviet Union, and it was called communism, but it never really played out quite the way that Marx thought it was. Basically, what it is coming from is a concern for the exploitation of laborers by business owners. If you ever try to serve an internship in broadcasting, you'll feel this because you won't be paid. And basically, you'll be used for your labor. Of course, you're learning skills, and that's very helpful in making connections, but you're not going to be paid for the very good jobs that you're doing. And that's kind of what communism grew up around. It's the exploitation of laborers by wealthy business owners. And it grew up mostly in the former Soviet Union, and Russia also made its way to Cuba. And we still have countries today, North Korea, that consider themselves communist. China is in between communism and socialism. Basically, what a communist media system is all about is that once again, the media serve the will of the state. However, in this case, the media are actually owned by the state. And that the state, furthermore, is a caretaker of the well-being of society. It's a caretaker. It puts itself in that position, and it says that since there's only one political party that's valid, communism, the communism is going to run the show. Now, most of what we think about with communism is very repressive, people living in means of poverty, and some of those things are true to a large extent, but what you may not know about communism is that when it comes to a media system, it tries to elevate the quality of life for people in terms of intellectualism and serenity and safety. And so, for example, in China, their communist media system has them putting on a lot of operas. It has them putting on a lot of theatrical plays. It has them putting on a lot of shows which remind China of its ancient history. You see a lot of these kinds of content areas on Chinese television is trying to elevate the tastes rather than having the population be absorbed by the Kardashians or Bruce Jenner's car accident. Or even something like SNL, the 40th anniversary, as funny as it was. Those things are nice for us to see, and they're amusing, and they do help our spirit. But how are they deepening our intellectualism? How are they deepening our ability to understand who we are and what our place is in, at this particular point in life? Communism tries to address that more. The implementation of communism is, once again, censorship in China. You have a whole army of government officials that review newspaper articles before they can go into print. But just by and large, the editors and the writers, they know that they cannot print an article that's going to say that the Chinese premier made a bad decision when he refused to visit with a dignitary from Australia. You're not going to see that kind of criticism because they know that it's not allowed. So they sort of self-censor. They censor themselves. And there's punishment as well. You can be taken away and never to be heard from again in a communist system if you really violate the system. That's called being disappeared. Funny way to say it, huh? All right, let's move on now to the fourth philosophy for today. This one's called social responsibility. The United States is responsible for this philosophy because it grew up out of a professor's commission, Professor Hutchins, in the 1940s. And he was really concerned with what had happened to media content in the 1940s during wartime. A lot of the media content was really cynical and was portraying politicians as automatically being corrupt. And therefore, Hutchins was worried that people weren't going to vote and they were going to opt out of the political process because they were just so disillusioned. Also, a lot of our media was very racist. We had a lot of cartoon trailers in film theaters that were saying, "Kill a Jap today," as part of the war effort. And so Hutchins put together this commission. They came up with this philosophy called social responsibility. And it's the idea that government should take steps to provide fair and balanced info, but government shouldn't control the media. But also it calls upon media executives, media editors, media personnel to themselves act responsibly. Don't only have bad news at the top of the hour. Make sure that you have some good news. Don't only talk about the murders, the fires, the car accidents. Also talk about how a new park has been built in a neighborhood or how the deficit has come down. That's all part of social responsibility. It's calling on both the government and the media to have different roles. And the government is seen as more like a referee. The government stands on the sidelines, but if somebody is holding on the 4-yard line, the government's going to step onto the field and throw a big yellow flag out as a penalty for the offender. So that's how social responsibility works. Interestingly enough, even though it was invented here in the United States, the place that it's been practiced the most is actually in Europe, in some of the countries in this book included Sweden, France, and England and the UK. They are practicing much more social responsibility when they do things like saying no ads are targeted towards children in our country, period. It's not right. We need to be responsible. Children can't make the decision about what they should purchase or not. That's what Sweden does, by the way. All right, the principles of social responsibility are balance, and also to try and clarify what the goals are of your organization so that people know, are you a money maker? Are you trying to be the first with local news? Are you trying to be the best? Are you conservative? Are you liberal? Clarify those goals. Now we're going to move on to our final two philosophies for today. Both of these are kind of newcomers in the grand scheme. They haven't been around for centuries like the others, and they're still in their formative stages as a result. The first one is called developmental philosophy, and this was born out of the idea that the other philosophies don't really fit those countries that are experiencing a lot of poverty and a lot of fragility. And so we need a philosophy that helps them, and that's what development philosophy is. And what this says is that in those poor countries that don't have the resources, resources like electricity in some areas, which is the case for Ghana, or resources like qualified TV producers, takes a lot to train somebody to be one. The government has to stimulate that. And at the same time, the private sector has to rely on the government for this help without tearing the government down. So it calls for kind of a mutually friendly, beneficial relationship between the government and the media in developing countries. And the media are further called upon to pass out information that will help the population overcome some of the really deep problems. Like if you're a young female and you grow up in Ghana, you may be totally unaware of deodorant. You may be unaware of condoms. You may be unaware of sexual promiscuity in terms of spreading diseases. Now, I'm not only meaning to pick on females here. What I'm trying to say is that as a result, the Ghana media would be targeting these females with educational public service announcements. They're just going towards females. They would talk differently towards males than they would towards females about these issues, but just staying with females for the moment, that's what developmental media philosophies are about, to get the media to help And so think about it. You could actually take a college course on your television if you wanted to. Why shouldn't you be able to? Yeah, sure. Every night you have to be in front of your TV. There's going to be a lecture. It wouldn't be that different from going to a huge lecture in the SciTech building. And then you can take an exam online. Why don't our media do that? Because they're profit-based and there's not a lot of profit in that. In a developmental media system, you have more media doing that. They're trying to develop the country's infrastructure, develop the country's education, develop the country away from disease and the kinds of things that especially affect children. So that's a pretty new one. And now we come to our final philosophy for today, which is the democratic participant philosophy, also coming about in the United States, coming about mostly because of technological changes. It's a really exciting philosophy. It speaks to a lot of the way that you guys live your lives. Basically, you had a guy by the name of Jay Rosen. He's a professor in the 1970s, and he was recognizing that a lot of groups in the 70s were disenfranchised from the media. That is to say, they were not a part of the media. Like if you walked out of your dorm room or your apartment right now and say, I want to call a press conference on this stomach virus that's going around ESU because I have some thoughts about that. Who would come? Would the Pocono Record come? Would Blue Ridge Cable come? Would CBS News come? Nobody's coming, right? No offense, but nobody's coming because media only take notice of experts and regular go-to people that are well-known, etc. So Jay Rosen recognized that the average person doesn't have a say in the media sphere of discussion, and so he started to advocate what's called democratic participant journalism, but it's become a kind of a philosophy too. And the idea is that today with smartphones like I'm speaking on right now, YouTube, all the social media, Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, as well as texting and email, is the average person can make a big impact. The average person can create a video like Bruce Jenner in his car accident the other day. An average person was the one who shot that. And now that person's stuff is making it into the news, even though the channels that get a hold of it, E! Entertainment and TMZ and those channels, they're gonna shape the content itself. But at least today, you have the opportunity. Look at Jenna Marbles, for example, or Justin Bieber. These are people who broke through into fame because of YouTube. And so it's certainly possible today to have a democratic citizen movement. And that's why on Facebook, you have a lot of pages going around, like animal rights, for example, or dislike this political party, the Republicans or the Democrats, or come on out to an event tonight that is a blood drive for the Red Cross. This, in its essence, is democratic participant philosophy. It means that everybody now has a chance to participate in the media sphere through the technologies that they have. So that right there will wrap up our conversation about media systems and the philosophies that undergird them. It's that part of the tree that you can't really see unless you dig down for it. Have a great day.